Welcome to Recharge. I'm Jonathan. Austin is not here with us tonight. I think he already posted a video that he has the Rona sitting there at home, and I know it's driving him crazy already. But y'all pray for him. Pray that he doesn't drive himself crazy trying to find things to do, happen to be at home. He was going to be the host tonight, so and I was going to talk about our subject matter for Bible study, but instead, I'm really pleased I was able to twist Jennifer's arm and really get her to come up here and take Austin's place for tonight. So I'm really excited about that. Well,
I cannot take Austin's place for sure.
Well,
but full disclosure, Jonathan's wanted me to do this all along.
Yeah.
I've been super uncomfortable.
So I guess technically you're the host now for tonight. Jennifer, this is my wife if you don't know her.
Hey.
What we're doing is we're working through the Old Testament. We're using Recharge Bible Study as sort of a survey of the Old Testament, and we started in a different place. We started with the writings part of the Hebrew Bible, so we're taking a different tack on the order of the books that we go through. So this is the fourth book of the writing section of the Hebrew Bible, and the fourth book happens to be the Song of Solomon. So in full disclosure, I found this book to be one of the more difficult books not to read. It's a fun book to read. You'll see why in just a minute. But trying to make a place for it is in terms of why is it even in the Scriptures in the first place? Because it's really unlike probably any other book of the Bible that we can imagine. We have stories. Most of the Bible is stories. This is not stories. A lot of the Bible is songs of praise to God, songs of instruction. We have a lot of letters of instruction in the Old and New Testament. But Song of Solomon, unlike anything else, is a collection of poems and a collection of poems about love. So it's the subject of what pop music might be about, of what typically movies and plays and books and all these things in our culture are familiar to us about love. And poetry was something familiar to the culture of 3,000 years ago about love. But why is it in the book that's meant to tell us about God? And that's what we're really going to get to tonight. So what I want to explain to you, where I hope we go, is to answer this question. Why does a book that's a collection of poems about love matter for the Christian church? Obviously, Solomon was not a Christian. He lived before Christ. He was a Jew. And Christ makes no appearance in here. So why does it matter for the Christian church? And I heard a podcast yesterday on the Gospel Coalition, and the speaker was Rebecca McLaughlin. And she did a really good job explaining why Christians biblically must talk about and have a standard for what we call sexual ethics. And you'll find a lot of those in Song of Solomon. But you won't find them strictly proposed. You won't find them in a like a teaching didactic sort of way, but you gather them from the way that the poetry is presented. But this is what Rebecca McLaughlin said about why does marriage and sex matter for the Christian? And she says that actually the cross lies at the heart of any Christian understanding of sexuality. We see it again at the very beginning. The first notes come to us from Genesis, when God creates male and female in His image. We see it in the Old Testament prophets, as time and again they compare God to a loving, faithful husband in Israel to his unfaithful wife. We see when Jesus steps onto the stage of human history and declares that He is the bridegroom. We see it in Ephesians chapter 5, where Paul presents human marriage as a tiny little picture of Jesus' love for His church. We see it again in the book of Revelation, when a great multitude shouts that the wedding of the Lamb has come. And Jesus, His marriage to His church, brings heaven and earth back together. This is why marriage is male-female, and why husbands and wives are called to different roles, like Christ in the church. It's a love across difference, like Christ in the church. It's a love built on sacrifice, by Christ in the church. It's a love creating, flesh uniting, never-ending, exclusive love. Marriage is meant to point us to Christ. It's also meant to disappoint us, because even the best human relationship can only be a tiny echo of Jesus' love for us. And we also forget, Christian marriage was countercultural from the beginning in the first century. In the Greco-Roman world, men were not expected to be faithful to their wives, let alone to pour themselves out and love sacrificially them. It was fine for them to sleep with other women and often other men as well. So if marriage today feels countercultural, it did in the first century too. And if we're asked to tell somebody why we believe that marriage is between one man and one woman, our response should be to tell them the gospel. There is no other truly biblical way to answer that question. So what we believe about marriage, what we believe about sex, it matters to us as Christians because it's ultimately a picture of what we believe about God. But saying all that, let's get into the book itself, and I believe you have some questions to point us there.
Well, I do, but I was thinking about that as you were reading and before this, and how the idea of Christian marriage being countercultural, how it was countercultural then and it's countercultural now. Like we look at the Bible sometimes and we think, oh, that was way back, that's not applicable, but it's totally applicable because it's still being looked at as a wrong thing. The world does not line up with what Scripture teaches, and because it's at opposition. So my first question would be something I always wondered, and especially for people maybe who are just now reading the Bible, is why is it called Song of Songs? You hear also it being called Song of Solomon. Okay.
You'll also hear it called canticles, which is another way of saying songs. But you find the title for Song of Solomon is in the first line. So if you have your Bible, you can open it up. Song of Solomon 1:1. Its title is right there in the first line. The Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. So
it's right there in the text.
So it can be song. So it can be canticles. It can be Song of Songs. I think the Hebrew is reminiscent of when it will say Lord of Lords. So like this is the greatest song. And it's a collection of it's the greatest song of all, but it can also mean that it's a song that's a collection of songs.
I knew you would know the answer. So the first question is, what is the historical background of this book? So kind of help set this up for us.
Okay, so it tells us from the beginning that it is from Solomon. Now, there's some debate. Does that mean necessarily that Solomon is the one who wrote Song of Solomon? And because when it says which is Solomon's, it doesn't necessarily have to mean that he wrote it himself. It could mean that he commissioned it. It could mean that he inspired it in a sense that somebody wrote it for him or wrote it about him. Or it can mean that it's in the tradition of some of the songs that he actually wrote. But I think the easiest thing the easiest reading of that is just to say that it is written by Solomon's. We know that there were a lot of this kind of poetry was very common during the reign of Solomon. So Solomon was a king. He was the son of David. He ruled after David. We're told. I'm gonna skip on over to. Actually, I'm not going to skip there yet. But we're told in 1 Kings, that's the book of the Bible that tells us about who Solomon is. And we're told that he was the wisest man to ever live. We're told that one of the things that he did was he wrote, I think, 1,000. It gives us a number in Kings, how many songs that he wrote. 1,005 songs. So it would make perfect sense to think that, well, this is one of the, these are a collection of maybe 14 to 30 of the 1,005 songs that he wrote. But we know he also had musicians in his court. He had poets in his court. He had authors in his court. They could have written some of them as well, and Solomon put them together. We also know that likely some kings later and scribes later took maybe what Solomon wrote and collected them and put it together. So Solomon very likely did not give us Song of Solomon in the form that we find it, but I think he wrote the poems, and then other people who came later put them together and said this is a collection of love poems from Solomon.
So when we read about Solomon in the Bible, I know my first experience in reading the Bible was we learn about how he was a man who wanted wisdom. That was his ultimate desire. He was the wealthiest of the wealthy. He had all kinds of animals and anything you can imagine. But he went to God and he said, the one thing I want is wisdom. And then later we'll talk about how that changed.
Yeah.
But it made me think of a little story about us when we met, because we met on a mission trip. That sounds so dorky. We met on a mission trip, but I remember just a pattern in my teenage life was, I have to have a boyfriend to like find my value and my worth, and I never had a boyfriend, and I was always really disappointed in that. But as I started to draw closer to the Lord, I found that story about Solomon, his desire being about wisdom, how all he wanted was wisdom. And I remember very specifically meeting Jonathan on that trip and kind of starting to think like, this could be a boyfriend, and reading that passage and thinking, okay, Lord, my heart's desire is to have wisdom. That's what I want. That's the kind of person I want to be. And then the next day he asked me out. So I mean, not saying that that's what made it work, but it was just it was really cool for me, for my heart to finally truly desire wisdom. I was searching for all these other things to fill me up, but it wasn't until I got alone with the Lord and realized that's not what's important. Gaining his insight and what he wants for my life kind of turned my life on a very different path. So we talked about kind of the good things with Solomon, but then he takes a little turn. So do you want to discuss that?
Are you a fan of Solomon or not?
I mean, it's like we were talking about this earlier today, and it was like kind of like an old guy that just kind of wanders off. When you read the passage, it's like he was a pretty smart guy. I knew what was going on, but can I tell that story?
Yeah.
Okay. There's like this video out on YouTube of like Joe Biden at a speech, and he just kind of wanders off, and nobody knows where he's wandering to. And I'm not getting political. It's just a really funny video. And I told John, I said, kind of sounds like Solomon. Like he was there for the right reasons. He started out real great, and then you just see him wandering. And that was the mental image I got.
Good. That's a really good picture. So we're told about Solomon's wandering in 1 Kings 11. I'm just going to read you verbatim what 1 Kings 11 says, because Solomon actually seems like a really interesting or odd choice to be writing. If God was going to choose somebody to write a book about love, in one way Solomon would be a good choice because of the wisdom. We find out he also had a lot of wives. So he had a lot of opportunity for wives. But that was actually the problem, because Solomon did not live out the ideal of what's portrayed in his book. So you can say, did he actually write it? Or was he saying, do as I say and not as I do? Or did he write it maybe before he went astray? We don't know the answer to any of those questions.
So it made me think really quickly, just in light of what was preached on Sunday morning as well, like God was still glorified in the life of Solomon. And so even at the end of his life, as he made these really poor decisions, God was still able to use Solomon. And so I'm thinking about like personal application. I know this is kind of study, but I'm thinking, just for somebody that's tuning in and listening, your story's not over. Like God can still bring glory to his name in your life.
That's true. So here's what happened to Solomon in 1 Kings 11. Now Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh. So his first wife was recorded to be the daughter of Pharaoh, and because Solomon was a king, it was a political marriage. You used marriage as an opportunity. If you're a king, you marry yourself, you marry your sons and your daughters off to bring alliances with neighboring or maybe even far off kingdoms. And so Solomon was no different in that regard. So he had an alliance with Pharaoh that was solidified by the fact that he married one of Pharaoh's daughters. And there's some debate as to whether Pharaoh's daughter might even be the inspiration for some of the poems in Song of Solomon, which seems very likely. But in addition to the daughter of Pharaoh, he had Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, "You shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their God." So that goes back to some of the things Austin talked about in the story with David. Like David went to war with these people. Remember Solomon's father, and David was doing God's work in destroying them, leaving neither man nor woman alive. But here his son is now marrying some of the princesses of these people. So that's a big problem for the son of David to be doing this. And God had warned him that this is what would happen. But Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines. So concubines, just a girlfriend. That's a biblical word for a girlfriend. A king couldn't legally marry a non-royal person, so he would just kept them as concubines, not to say that he loved them any more or any less than his wives. But his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Shemosh, the abomination of Moab, and Moloch, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. And so he did for all his foreign wives, who made offerings and sacrifices to their gods. And the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who appeared to him twice. And he commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. But he did not keep what the Lord commanded. So, Solomon, we're also told, was the richest man alive. God brought him wealth because he had asked for wisdom, but then he kind of threw the wisdom out the window, because in those days, I think he was just following the culture of the day. One of the people, thankfully, people don't ask this question in our culture, but in those days, people asked this question: how many wives should you marry? And the answer was usually as many as you can afford, without any consideration for what is God's original design for marriage. So Solomon fell into that. He could afford to keep up 1,000 wives, and so that's what he did. But what happened was exactly what God said would happen. The wives did not conform to worship of Yahweh, but instead Solomon and his kingdom conformed to make space for the worship of all these other gods. And that's ultimately what led to the downfall of Solomon.
So looking at all of that, how is the book structured, and what is the basic outline? All right. With it being a poem, basically, or collection of poems.
It's a collection of poems for sure, and so you need to read it as poetry. We talked about this with some of the other books that we've already done. Proverbs is an example of a collection of poems, and so one mistake I think a lot of commentators and a lot of, frankly, even people who have preached Song of Solomon make is that it's presented as a narrative, and it's not a narrative. It's an anthology of poems. It's not a story on a timeline. So get that. It's if you try to read it as a timeline of a love between one man and one woman, you'll get a lot of things. Just really, you'll have a lot more questions than you have those questions answered. The other thing is you can't. We don't exactly know how many poems it is. It could be anywhere from like 14 poems to there might be 30 some different poems, because scholars are not all convinced where one poem ends and another begins. However, they are put together to create themes. There are themes that we'll find within the book, and that's where I believe sometime probably after the exile was when we see Song of Solomon. It appears in the Hebrew Bible, in the Hebrew Scriptures, and we know this because it's one of what's called the 5 Megilloth in Judaism even today. And all a Megilloth is that's a Hebrew word for a little scroll. So this is a small book. You can read it. You can sit down and read it in one sitting. And in fact, a lot of Jewish people do today. For a lot of families, even, it's part of the weekly Shabbat meal. They'll sit down, they'll read Song of Solomon or read a portion of Song of Solomon. And we'll get to why they do that. But the outline, the structure of the book, we have 8 chapters in our Bible. Of course, the original scrolls did not have chapters. The chapters were added probably about 1,000 years ago. But you'll see some clear themes going on. could be, so I read a lot of commentary on Song of Solomon to prepare for this, and I can't get any, and the one thing you'll find is that there's no consensus from any two commentators as to why it's structured the way it is.
Yeah, you were racking your brain.
Yeah,
like, Jen,
that's why I said
it's
one of the hardest. This was one of the hardest Bible studies to prepare for that I've had to prepare for. So, for example, I read Chuck Swindoll, his outline. I read how he outlines the Song of Solomon, and I've heard a lot of preachers preach it this way, but it just doesn't fit. It doesn't make sense. He divides the book into 3 sections: the courtship, the wedding, and a maturing marriage. That's the way he breaks it down. Now, the problem with that, well, there's several problems with that, one of which is they're having sex in the very beginning, or they're speaking language where they're thinking about sex in the very beginning. Now, even in Judaism at the time that this was put together, it was widely known that it was immoral to have sex before marriage. That was part of Judaism. It's still part of the Christian ethic today. So it wouldn't make sense to have that as part of the courtship in the book. So I'm so I don't think that you can divide the book up into that. The best outline that I was able to find is a man, Tom Dyson. You'll probably know who he is, J. Vernon McGee. J. Vernon McGee, he went through like in the 1970s, he went through every book in the Bible, the entire Bible actually. He's still on the radio some today. But he actually has an outline, and he divides it up. Basically, the way J. Vernon McGee states it is, some people say this is a one woman being pursued by a shepherd and being pursued by a king, and she chooses the shepherd. Or in another telling, she chooses the king, but she really loves the shepherd. Or in another, but in J. Vernon McGee's telling, he says she loves Solomon, and this actually makes a lot of sense. She believes Solomon is the suitor. She believes he's a shepherd, but he turns out to be a king, which makes a lot of sense. If you know anything about David, and David was known as the shepherd king, it would make a lot of sense for his son to also, at least poetically, be known as the shepherd king. So, chapter 1, it opens up. Basically, chapters 1 and 2 are all about shepherd life.
Kind of makes me tie back into the Psalm study we've been doing. Solomon, his dad was a shepherd.
He had been a shepherd, yeah.
He would have been very familiar with that, although he wasn't raised under that. Your dad tells you stories, so he would have, and he was in that culture, so he would have understood what it meant to be a shepherd. Exactly.
And we're found that this bride, she's not a princess. Like she is a woman who works. She has tan skin, not from ethnicity necessarily, but because the sun has burned it. She's working for a living now, and that was considered less attractive to have a woman who works for a living.
She's got a farmer's tan.
She's got a farmer's tan, in other words. But yet her lover was a shepherd who appreciated those things. And so chapter 1, verses 1 through 8 is where she seems to meet the shepherd. In 9 through 17, she falls in love with the shepherd. And there's actually some pretty sexually charged language right there from the outset. In chapter 2, the setting moves, but it moves to basically a more royal setting, actually a vineyard, a royal vineyard. So shepherds did not own vineyards typically, but kings owned vineyards. And so love is spoken of as something that takes place in a vineyard, in a garden. That's a key theme that we're going to get to later. Why is love spoken of as something that happens in a garden? At the end of following J. Vernon McGee's outline, the second part of chapter 2, the return of the bridegroom after a trip abroad, and the bride is happy with anticipation of his return. So we get down to chapter 3, and the bride dreams. And so you have to put some of this poetry in the context of a dream. But in chapter 3, verse 5, we see a line that's repeated a couple other times within the Song of Solomon in other poems. And this is at the end of the dream. She says, I adjure you, daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or does of the field, that you not stir up or awaken love until it pleases. So the meaning of that line there can actually be a twofold meaning. One is, my lover's asleep, don't wake him up, he's a pretty sleeper. But I think there's actually a better meaning there. And she's actually saying, love, romance has its place. And it has the right place, it has the right time. Don't stir up or awaken it until that time comes. And that's one of the ethics of love that we're taught about in Song of Solomon. Proceeding on, after this dream, the bridegroom comes into to take his bride. It's a wedding scene. In those days, that's the way weddings happen. It wasn't that a bride walked down the aisle, but it was that the bridegroom goes to where the bride is and receives her. And when the bridegroom shows up, he shows up with all of his splendor. And in this case, it's not a shepherd showing up; it's a king that shows up to take the bride away. And the only possible reference to God in the whole psalm is in chapter 3, verse 6, where it says, "What is it coming up from the wilderness like columns of smoke, perfumed with myrrh and frankincense, with all the fragrant powders of a merchant?" And then we're told it's Solomon coming with all the strong men coming.
She was probably like, "Oh, yay! This guy's got money."
But the reference to God is that he's coming with columns of smoke. So there's a lot of commentators who will say that's meant to evoke God coming for his lover. Chapter 4 is no longer the bride, and this is an interesting thing. It's mostly the bride speaking throughout most of these poems. Which is interesting to have the voice of a woman over the voice of a man, but that's what we find. But the man's voice comes out solidly in chapter 4, and he starts describing her body, and it's about as explicit as any love song that you'll find today. But then at the end of chapter 4, you have the response of the bride to the groom, telling her just how hot and sexy her body is. And she says, "Let my beloved come to his garden and eat its choicest fruits." So you know exactly what she's thinking there. But she's responding. I take that as she's responding, wanting to make love because she feels cherished. She feels valued. She feels like she's wanted by her husband. Then you have. But then you go to chapter 5 and you have more scenes. You have a scene where she loses her lover again, and you're like, haven't we already read this in chapter 1? That's why it's hard to speak about this as a time progression. And he actually comes to her door and leaves myrrh on it, which was a kind of custom that they had for suitors, not for married people.
What made me think about in Genesis, you have man and woman being created, but then you go into the deeper story. So almost like that, where it's this scene, but then there's another scene that goes in with some more detail. That's kind of what I'm thinking about when you're talking.
That's a very good insight that I didn't think about. So it may be a restart of the same story that we've already seen.
That threw you off. I'm sorry.
It was good. You get back to the end of chapter 5, and it's mostly the voice of the woman throughout chapter 5. But then she, the way that the bridegroom praised the bride's body in chapter 4, now the bride is praising the bridegroom and his body in chapter 5.
So it could have served as a parallel, when you think about it.
in a lot of ways. And it's showing that that love is a two-way street, which was especially for a king in those days, especially for the way that marriage was. It was seen as marriage was meant to serve the king. Marriage was meant to serve the man. But the picture of marriage that you get in Song of Solomon is not a man-centered marriage. It's a mutual. It's a love that's mutual. It's for the mutual benefit, the mutual satisfaction of both the man and the woman. And that's very clear throughout the songs.
And very intimate, that it is not just everybody else involved. It's these two people, and it's this really beautiful love story. I know, we're talking about other things, but how that intimacy of a love story exists.
Yeah. And I think this is really, and I think that's key, because I think this is really, I think Song of Solomon shaped what Judaism, but then later what Christianity thought about romance. It has shaped what we think about what marriage should be. One of the distinctives of Christianity is that Christianity has always believed in a mutual marriage, in a marriage that's not meant to serve the man or the woman more over the other, but that they're mutually to love each other unconditionally and love each other intimately. Like, for a Christian, marriage isn't just to produce children. Oh,
you got it.
Let me get it.
Yeah.
Well, this is coming off my ears. It's no good. Yeah, marriage and sex is not just for producing children, although that is part of it, but it's for relational intimacy between a man and a woman, between the two sexes of a species of humans who are nothing alike, who have a hard time understanding each other, but yet we come together and we know each other closer than anyone else. And that's meant for a man and a woman, which is kind of counterintuitive when you really think about it, but yet that's God's design.
And the vulnerability of that, that picture of this is someone I am completely vulnerable with in front of, and that comparison of being vulnerable with the Lord. But I know you'll get into that later.
No, that's good. We're told in chapter 6, the woman is called a couple times a Shulamite. Shulamite is not, from what my research says, it's not referring to a nationality. We don't know of any group of people named the Shulamites, but it probably means that the woman is a picture of Solomon too. She's the female version of Solomon. Shulamite, Shulaman. So, just for what that's worth, I don't know what that means, but it's but it is meant to picture Solomon.
You're talking about it being poetry, and you think about all the. I mean, I'm going to get technical here, but all the literary devices that you have in poetry, that would make sense.
Yep.
That parallel.
Yeah. Chapter 7, you have a chorus of women who are praising the beauty of the bride, and then you have more from the bride and the groom describing their love and their marriage, and then it ends the book with a whole series of poems. But again, in chapter 8, 3, and 4. They repeat some of the things that are in some of the other poems. His left hand is under my head, and his right hand embraces me. I adjure you, daughters of Jerusalem, that you not stir up or awaken love until it pleases. So
that was a lot.
A lot.
I'm looking at the outline up here, and I'm like,
we finished the outline right there.
But you've talked about a lot of different things. So what's the big picture? What's the big idea of the whole book?
So we talked about the specifics, so now we need to bring it all together. This gets into how are we supposed to interpret it, and this is what's been very interesting. The reason I wanted to have Austin up here is because Austin preached this book probably 10 years ago or so, and he preached it pretty much the way that we're presenting it, that it's love poetry between a man and a woman, and that's what it's about. So what the book is about tells us what the big idea is. The thing is that for 2,500 years of history, up until probably 40 years ago in America, this book was not seen primarily as a love story between a man and a woman. Probably only for about the last 40 years have Christians said, oh, this is love poetry about marriage and sex and all of those things. We've instead had followed what the Jews originally said about it in their Bible, in that it's a allegory or a spiritually meant collection of poems that's meant primarily not to tell us about love between a man and a woman, but to tell us about love between God and his people collectively. And that's been for 2,500 years the primary interpretation of the Song of Solomon. And how we're interpreting it now is it does say something about that, but it primarily says it about marriage. So that's a huge difference. So I look at it as sort of a chicken and an egg question that we need to have answered. When these poems are written, and then when they were compiled into a book that would be sacred scripture, were they intended to tell us about the love between God and his people, or were they intended to tell us about what love and sex and marriage should be or should be like between a man and a woman? I think we come down more towards the latter, that we're saying this is intended not first and foremost as a picture of God and his people, but it's intended first and foremost as a picture of marriage. And so that matters in terms of the big idea. Now, does it tell us something about God and his people? Yeah, it does. But that's not the primary intent. But others will disagree with me, and those others include almost, and this is what gives me pause, is that it includes almost everyone who has read and interpreted this book throughout human history.
So do you think it says more about us than it does about the passage?
I think that's exactly right. I think we live in an age where we're looking for good, godly instruction on marriage. I think about the state that, particularly in America, the state that even Christians are in, where we don't have good pictures in our midst of what a solid marriage between a man and a woman is supposed to be. I mean, they're there, but, I think about most kids don't grow up in that kind of environment today. Like, most people don't. Most people come from broken homes or they've seen broken marriages. And so you look in the last 40 years, we've wanted to look for good, solid teaching of what can a marriage be, what should a marriage be. And we've realized, it's right under our nose in the Song of Solomon. How do you romance a woman? It's right there in the Song of Solomon. How does a woman respond and romance a man? Yeah, you like that. You're like, what? That was in chapter 2, wasn't it?
Yeah, when we were going through this, I was like, well, duh, she wants some food. Yes, I resonate with that.
Yeah, you had that somewhere in there.
Woo her.
Oh, she says, sustain me with raisins, refresh me with apples, for I'm sick with love. So, hey,
buy me some
doesn't
chicken
hurt to
at
take your
Outback.
woman out for a good meal, So that leads us to an important question that goes along with what's the big idea of the book. Because if the big idea is this, most people actually have thought in the past that the big idea is this question. Go ahead and ask that fourth question there.
So how does the book point to Jesus, and how do you find Jesus or God when God isn't even mentioned in the book?
Yeah, so if this book was written about God's relationship with his people, that's easy. You just say, well, the whole thing is about Jesus as the bridegroom coming to take his people. It seems a little odd, though, when you look at all the sexual language. That seems just to naturally fit with, this book is about marriage. It's not really about God and his people. It's about marriage. However, as Christians, going back to that first quote that we had, Christians, we understand that marriage is about God, ultimately. God has to be at the center. God has to be the focus. God gave us marriage so that we would understand something about him. So Song of Solomon, it's removed a step from telling us about the new covenant. It's removed a step from telling us about Jesus, but it is there. You can glimpse through it's kind of like a prism. You're looking through the Song of Solomon and you're seeing marriage. And looking beyond that marriage, you're seeing Jesus.
I mean, that would make sense with it being poetry.
Yeah.
You know, there's so much imagery in poetry. And, you know, there's the story that you see, but then what's the story you don't see?
Yeah, that's right. There's a famous scripture in the New Testament that tells us why this is about ultimately, why it is ultimately about Jesus. Will you share that with us from
Sure.
Ephesians 5?
Because you know I love this so much, right?
What's
We
harder
talk
on me?
about submission
Yeah,
and how I have, it's been a refining process for me. So, I'll read it, sure.
Well, there's a lot more written to men here than there is women.
I know. We talk about this a lot. All right. Ephesians 5. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband.
Very good. So I'm just going to read verbatim what I wrote about what does it mean for the Christian. If this book is primarily about the restoration of human flourishing in the relationship of marriage, and that relationship is so key and so vital that the New Testament tells us that marriage actually gives us a picture of Christ and his church, then through the principle of transference, you can say that the Song of Solomon gives us a picture of Jesus, not directly, but indirectly, of Jesus and his love for the church. We can say this without saying that poems were written about Jesus.
All right, so our last question. How does the book motivate your love for God and others? Like, how is it able to do that? The Great Command.
So the way I read this, there's two ways you could read it. You could read it like the psalm, and it could be part of your worship time with God. And I have a hard time with that. Maybe other people don't. I have a hard time with that. I'm not going to read this book the way that I read the Psalms. However, what this book does do is it motivates me to love my wife. And that's a big deal when you get to Ephesians 5. Ephesians 5 says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loves the church, which is a heavy, heavy, heavy standard. A heavy standard. He died for it. He died for the church. So daily, you as a husband are to die, put yourself last, put your wife first, die to your needs, put her needs first, and that's what it means to love your wife.
And that your wife would know that. I mean, I've told you before, like, I feel like you would die for me, and I know that, and so it's important that your wife would know that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so why is that key, though? Can you have a good marriage without Christ? Many non-Christians do. Many non-Christians have what you would call a good marriage, but is it a Christian marriage? And so we in the church, we need to talk and think, and most importantly, we need to act on what is the ideal marriage, and we need to strive for it.
And even just that language, again, going back to the language that was in the book, the level of intimacy and the description and the detail, that is the level of love that God has for us and wants us to love him back.
Yep. I'm looking to see if there's any questions or comments on here. Are there any questions from the audience? But this to me is the big idea.
You should definitely read the book.
Yeah. So I'll say this too. So, we talked about the garden aspect. This is a theme throughout Song of Solomon. There's a garden, and the romance, the love, even the love making in some cases takes place in a garden. This is why that's important. Go back to Genesis 1. Where did God create man and woman and place them?
In the garden.
In the garden. So in a sense, these poems are meant to call our attention back to the garden, the Garden of Eden.
Where the first marriage occurred.
Where the first marriage occurred, where sex occurred before the fall of man. The Bible tells us the man and the woman were naked and unashamed because there was no sin in the world. There was nothing coming between them in that relationship. Like Adam and Eve had the greatest marriage ever because there was no sin to divide their intimacy with one another. When sin enters the world, then you have points in Song of Solomon. You have little foxes. You have
clothes.
You have clothes. You have family who's driving apart the love, and just all these things. Parts of the world divide people in marriage, but at its core, God intended marriage to be pure, undefiled intimacy between a man and a woman. And I believe there's a picture here that tells us that marriage at least has the potential, when we love each other unconditionally, love each other, the man loves the woman as Christ loves the church, the woman submits herself to the husband. I see in this imagery of Song of Solomon that there's, in all of that, in a Christian marriage, there's at least the potential for a piece of heaven on earth. That as we love one another, as we put Christ at the center of our marriage and we prioritize our marriage, what we're actually doing is we're saying this is a little taste of what God intends for eternity to be like. And it actually has a counter-effective, there's a counter-effect to sin, I believe, when a man and a woman do marriage God's way. That's my 2 cents.
Well, very good.
Well, with all that, we're glad that y'all are here with us. Glad that you joined us online. Feel free to email me. Put some notes in the comments. I will respond to those. If you have any questions, things I brought up that you're just like, that makes no sense. Can you explain it? Or if you just have a thought you want to share, just feel free to put it there. But we'll be back here next week. Let me see. Next week is...
Be the second, I think.
Be the
February
next...
second.
Yeah. So we'll be in the Megiloth. I can't remember. We've got Ruth. We might have Ruth next week, but I'm really excited about it, and we'll see you next week.